Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. The NATO bombing campaign in Kosovo has entered its second month. President Clinton continues to rule out the use of ground forces. But one of today's guests, Robert Kagan, writes in this week's Weekly Standard that eventually the United States and its NATO allies will send ground forces into Yugoslavia. A month into the war and many questions linger. Is NATO winning or losing? Is air power enough? And what does our war with Serbia tell us about the proper role of the United States as the world's sole surviving superpower? Or, for that matter, about the proper role of regional security agreements such as NATO? To answer these and other questions, Think Tank is joined by Robert Kagan, director of the U.S. Leadership Project at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace and a contributing editor to the Weekly Standard; Edward Luttwak, a senior fellow for preventive diplomacy at the Center for Strategic and International Studies and author of Turbo Capitalism, Winners and Losers in the Global Economy; and Ted Carpenter, Vice President for Defense and Foreign Policy Studies at the Cato Institute and author of Beyond NATO, Staying Out of Europe's Wars. The topic before the House: why Kosovo? This week on Think Tank. The war for Kosovo has uncovered some surprising political and strategic fault lines. Many conservatives who were hawks during the Cold War have turned dovish when it comes to dealing with the situation in Yugoslavia, and many Cold War doves who in the past often shunned the use of violence have turned into vehement hawks. These include several NATO leaders, most notably a one-time war protester named Bill Clinton. All of the turmoil in the Balkans raises an important question for America. What should be the role of the world's sole remaining superpower as we move out of this, the American century, and into what hopefully will be the next American century? To find out, we turn to our expert panel. Gentlemen, thank you for joining us. Let's just go around the room quickly with a mildly elemental question. Who's winning this war? Bob Kagan.
Well, right now I don't think anybody's winning. I think it's probably too much of a stretch to say Milosevic is winning, but it's also clear that NATO is not winning and will not win as long as it limits itself strictly to an air campaign.
NATO is not winning so long as it doesn't fight in earnest. Airplanes fly around, but they're used so cautiously that, in fact, we only have the form of air power, not its real content.
The air campaign was designed to prevent a Serb military offensive in Kosovo, to prevent the conflict in Kosovo from spilling over into neighboring states, and to undermine Milosevic politically. Not only has it failed to achieve those objectives, it has been spectacularly counterproductive with regard to all three objectives.
Well, let me say, for my part, that I think we are winning the war, that it is what we in the old Johnson administration used to call a graduated response or escalation, and it is working. And as as a veteran of the Air Force, Airman Second Class, I believe that, as Billy Mitchell did, that air power can be decisive. What do you think about that?
Well, I'm glad you brought up the Johnson administration, because I certainly would have brought it up.
I'm very proud of it.
I would have thought that the lesson of that is that graduated response is not, in fact, a very successful way to fight a war, and Johnson lost his presidency over that.
No, well, that's the latter part is not true, but
in any case,
arguable.
The only sense in which NATO is winning is that the campaign continues, and Milosevic is not doing well.
Haven't they sort of backed themselves into a corner where they can't lose? I mean, they've set the bar so high. You get almost 50 leaders of state coming here to Washington saying, we won't lose, we can't lose. And here's this little Mickey Mouse country, little country, Serbia. I mean, isn't it obvious that we're going to win?
Well, you're asking two different questions. One is, are we eventually going to win? I think the answer is yes, and that's because we're going to send in ground troops, which is the only way of winning. If the question is, are we winning now, I don't think the answer is yes.
I can agree with what you said, that you can say that NATO is winning. It's winning in a very, very slow, very torturous way. It's torturing the Serb people with its bombing, and it is allowing the Serbs to torture the Kosovars.
I agree with
The
that.
whole moral claim for this war is that this is a humanitarian war. It's a disinterested war. We're doing it for them. And you'll notice that nothing has been done for them. And as an airman, former airman second class, I'm sure you know that what's happened is that cowardice has been institutionalized. Cowardice has been turned into the operational format. You fly at 15,000 feet, therefore you don't fly low. Since you fly at 15,000 feet to be safely above the anti-aircraft, much of the time you protest that you cannot bomb at all because of bad weather. What they mean by bad weather is not the kind of clouds that stop you from bombing. It's the kind of clouds that stop you from bombing at your ideal safe altitude when you're doing, visual recognition type bombing.
I mean, would you be prepared to accept an amendment to your statement that this is not cowardice but caution?
No. It's
cowardice.
I insist that, you see, it's institutionalized cowardice. It is a consensus from the president to the operational commander. In this case, it would be the SACEUR, the Supreme Allied Command in Europe, through the different echelons. There's an agreement. You see, at the beginning of the war, for example, among the aircraft that were based in Italy were the A-10s. The A-10 is a specialized, one-purpose anti-tank
Warthog?
aircraft. Warthog, exactly. It is a specialized, it's sort of designed around a very big 30-millimeter cannon, a very powerful high-velocity cannon, and a huge magazine. The A-10 was present at the base in Italy from the beginning of the war. When the ethnic cleansing started, it took the specific form of small groups of Serbs, 80 to 150, terrorizing entire villages of Albanians because they were backed up by 3, 4, 5, 6 armored vehicles, troop carriers, tanks, and so on. The A-10s are sitting in Italy 20 minutes away. The A-10s are not sent in. The British do not send in the Harriers. The British, French, German, Italian armed helicopters are not sent in.
May we stipulate that there have been a lot of mistakes in this war? I mean, would everybody
It's not
agree
a
with
mistake.
that?
Stipulate that, but,
an
the question is...
unchanging stance. It's not a mistake. It's not like I made the wrong turn. From the beginning, we have watched the ethnic cleansing happen. We have seen it being carried out by very few Serbs. You know that the total number of Serb soldiers and police operating in Kosovo below 20,000. They were only last week they were reinforced, maybe above. And we've had specialized. We've been buying for years. We've been spending a lot of money to maintain, among other things, the Apache helicopters at a very high state of readiness. They complain, they whine when they don't have them at a very high state of readiness. Well, they were ordered into the theater, into Albania from Germany.
Okay, all right, hold
30 days ago, and they still have to fly the first mission.
Then the key is that even people who thought this was an appropriate mission for NATO, I think have to concede that the execution has bordered on absolute ineptitude. The administration and NATO appeared to have no contingency plans. The point with the Apache helicopters, why were they unavailable? If NATO thought that there was a possibility the rosy scenario would not turn out, that Milosevic would not cave in after a few days, one would think those would be made available. Why
Ted, I wanted to ask you the question. You were against going in originally. Are you among those number who say, well, now that we're in, we have to win, or do you say out now?
No, I'm a strong believer in limiting one's losses, in walking away from a policy mistake, not escalating matters and committing an even greater folly.
But
I think that's
if you
what
were
we're
president,
on the verge
you'd
of
pull the
doing.
troops out now.
I would search for a graceful diplomatic exit. The Russians have been offering one on several occasions. And I think NATO would be wise to take it as soon as possible, because the alternative is to escalate, is to put in ground forces. We have then a much more difficult war, and it's not going to be the kind of antiseptic war that NATO has had so far.
But, you know, again, getting back to some of the Vietnam rhetoric, there was a statement which I will try to clean up, which is if you got them by their private parts, their hearts and minds will follow. If you keep pounding on them by air, you don't have to have a land war if they say, okay, and the deputy prime minister of Yugoslavia this week said, you know, well, hey, we're going to lose this thing. Let's sit down and talk. Isn't it almost a no-brainer that we're going to prevail?
No, because you're making an assumption there that we are going to be able to carry out a bombing campaign as long as is necessary to bring Milosevic to heel. I think Milosevic feels that we will not, in fact, be able to sustain the will in the West to continue a bombing campaign, especially if the bombing campaign is not, in fact, solving the problem that it was meant to solve, which is the slaughter in Kosovo, especially as civilian casualties in Serbia and the suffering of the population of Serbia increases with no clear end in sight. And especially as Russia and Milosevic continue to throw out little peace feelers that are intended to fracture the alliance. We have a problem of staying power as well. It's not just a question of Milosevic. How long can the alliance continue doing this? Another month, another 2 months? I'm concerned that eventually the will to continue this bombing campaign that does not produce results will evaporate. And that's why I think we have to go toward a more serious prosecution of the war.
But they are beginning now to hit the power grid, to hit the media, to probably to hit the bridges. I mean, it's going to be. I mean, I think they should have done. If you're serious, as Ed says, you should have done this more quickly, and you would have saved more lives. And you have 19 powerful nations against one little state. I mean, it is. You don't have to be an expert in realpolitik if you're a Yugoslav to say we better get out of this thing. They're not going to have a country left.
They may not have a country left, but Milosevic only cares about one thing, which is his own position in power. He doesn't care how much the Serbs suffer any more than Saddam Hussein cares how much the Iraqis suffer. And we are not, at this moment, by ratcheting up slowly. Now, I know you don't want to get into tactics, but nevertheless, as you ratchet up slowly, the population and the person that you're trying to affect their decisions, they gradually accommodate themselves to each ratcheting up of the pressure. And as long as Milosevic can hold out hope that the Allies will not in the end be able to maintain the coalition throughout a long bombing campaign, he's going to hang in there on the basis of that hope.
In regard to the graduated bombing of Serbia, I'm much more sympathetic. And the precise point just made. When the bombing started, there was a possibility that the alliance would crack. Within a few days, the Italians, for example, asked for an Easter truce. However, because the bombing was so gradual, so measured, the effect is that the alliance has, in fact, kept together, has maintained and increased its cohesion, government, and therefore Milosevic is facing a relentless machine there, which I think will break his resolve.
Let me interrupt you. What are we doing there? As somebody who will answer this in a positive way, why don't we start with you, and let's devote the rest of the program to what the big picture is.
Well, what we're doing there is we're pursuing what has been an abiding American interest for 50 years at least, of trying to maintain both stability and some semblance of a decent order in Europe, which happens to be special in terms of what Americans care about.
So you don't agree with Ed that, oh, it's just humanitarian?
No, I don't agree that it's just humanitarian. I also, by the way, don't think that you can so neatly divide humanitarian concerns on one side and interests on the other. We are, after all, as are some other nations, but we are uniquely, the United States is uniquely a power that whose foreign policy is shaped in part by the principles that we represent at home. We have conducted a foreign policy for 50 years at least, and I would say for longer than that.
So by your scenario, Bob, what do we get if we win?
We gain some purchase on the future. We make it clear to potential aggressors, not only in Europe but elsewhere, to potential committers of genocide, especially in Europe but possibly elsewhere as well, that the United States and its allies do intend to try to preserve as much of a decent order as is possible and protect its interests when those interests are threatened.
What's wrong with that? We've lived through a horrific 20th century where people have been, particularly in Europe, been engaged in blood sport for the first half of this century at least, killing each other, and here's this group of 19 nations finally saying never again. For the 21st century, there's a bright new day ahead. What's your problem?
Well, I think it's an inappropriate comparison to compare 2,000 deaths in 13 months of civil war, which is what occurred up to the point of NATO bombing, with the Holocaust or the other horrific episodes of real genocide in the 20th century. As far as what we win,
I agree with you, but the Serbs had done real genocide earlier in Bosnia.
Even that is
200,000 people.
Now, if you examine the estimates by the International Committee of the Red Cross and the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute, neither organization has a dog in that fight. The estimates are in fact 55 to 75,000 dead. The 200,000 comes from the Bosnian government.
It's a lot of
Granted,
people.
But it's still basically garden variety civil war. But you ask, what do we win? Okay, we prevail. We get Milosevic to cave. We've already contributed to greater instability in the Balkans. We basically get most of the Balkans as a bouncing baby American protectorate. That might appeal to masochists, but I can't imagine why that's a great gain.
NATO protectorate.
Well, but this is still an American policy. Let's not kid ourselves.
But why should we not be involved
let me
in
just say,
maintaining a protectorate?
Let me just say a couple of things. First, this war, I didn't say that this was, the motive of this war was humanitarian. I said a war ostensibly being fought for humanitarian reasons doesn't look good when the whole world sees this powerful United States and its NATO allies not being willing to risk the lives of 3 pilots to save thousands of Albanians. This is how the coward behaves, the bully behaves, and so on. So one consequence of this war is that for the little peoples of the world, the message is, if you're protected by NATO,
now, and I just want to keep you out of hot water. I just want to keep you out of hot water. When you're talking about cowards and bullies,
institutionalized
and so you're not talking about America's brave fighting men and women.
No, I'm talking about
I just want to keep you.
No, the system that withdraws from Somalia after 18 people are killed. The overall political system. It's you and me, the Congress, the president. It's been absorbed by the Joint Chiefs and so on, and of course in conjunction with NATO, where you have the second generation of military officers in most countries, which have no military experience. The whole notion of actually fighting, actually killing, actually being killed, has become very alien. You know, things are all ritualized, but this is all beside the point.
This is sort of the Cap Weinberger, Colin Powell doctrine of never fight a war unless you can win it in advance and very antiseptically.
Americans are not, the American people is not really sentimental. They're going to figure out that all this, in the end, that perhaps you don't have to spend.
Okay, let's go back to the question that we asked.
Yes.
Why are we there? You're a strategic, long-term thinker, okay?
I think that one element of why we're there is that during the Cold War, we learned the habit of intervening in conflicts in order to prevent them escalating because of the fear that they might become a Cold War conflict. And so we learned the habit of stopping wars, getting in, stopping them. Well,
it worked pretty well.
It worked, and first of all, it worked very badly for the people whose wars were stopped, because wars that could have started and ended in weeks became 50-year conflicts, which were interrupted by ceasefires and armistices. Armistices are not peace, they congeal war. Behind the armistice line, you keep building up, you don't really have peace. It was a disaster for the Arabs and Israelis, who could have started and ended the war in 3 weeks, but they were stopped. It was a disaster, of course, India, Pakistan, Korea, all these situations of frozen war. War couldn't do its task of bringing peace by burning the resources and the will to fight war. That's how peace, but it was essential, and I accepted, because we could not afford the risk of escalation. Well, we've carried this habit over into the post-Cold War era. We don't have the risk of reciprocal interventions leading to nuclear war, yet we have this notion that the moment the war breaks out...
Ed, let me interrupt you because we're getting close to the end. Why are we there? Or do you think there's a good reason for us to be there? Mr. Kagan thinks there is. Mr. Carpenter thinks there is not. I think there is a very good reason. Do you have a position which you will state?
I think that the United States should not have intervened in this conflict, but should have thrust the responsibility on Europeans and forced them to do it, which it could have been done. Instead, because of what I consider an unnecessary activism, the United States maneuvered itself into the role
I
of
would
taking the
basically
lead.
agree with that, but this is broader. It's a manifestation of foreign policy hypochondria. We're not distinguishing between developments that matter to the United States, the behavior of a People's Republic of China, or the willingness of the major powers of Europe to stay at peace with one another. That's the kind of order, that's the kind of stability that's important to the United States, not
But
every petty
Ted,
conflict that might
Ted,
create a little instability in some peripheral region.
We have talked before in this program. You may correct me if I'm wrong, but you have been against any extension of American power.
That's not true. That is absolutely untrue.
Okay, that's why I said correct me if I'm wrong. Which one were you or the Cato Institution saying, right on, this is where we have to go?
I never quarreled with the need to contain Soviet power
No,
during
no,
the
okay.
Cold War era. That was
I
the kind of
that.
important
Yes,
macro international
but
development.
post-Cold
that's
War,
vital.
zero.
Well, we have intervened in places where it would be difficult to come up with a list of countries that are less strategically or economically relevant to the United States.
Can I just say that there's
Please.
a certain sense in which the Cold War has made us stupid. It's as if the only foreign policy we can imagine is the foreign policy of containing the Soviet Union. There was no foreign policy before that, and there's no foreign policy after that. I think it's worth recalling that the people who were rebuilding the international order, Dean Acheson and company, after the Second World War, before the Soviet Union had emerged in their minds as the threat that had to be dealt with, they were trying to prevent another World War II. They were trying to prevent another 1930s. And they set out on a project to try to create an international system with the United States as the core that would prevent more Ethiopias, more invasions of Manchuria, all the events of the 1930s from turning eventually into something much bigger. And it seems to me after the Cold War, we have to have the same general wisdom that the founders of the post-World War II period had.
Okay, I want to ask, we're just about at the end, I want to ask one other question. Isn't this, in its essence, from an American point of view and from a European point of view as well, notwithstanding the fact that we hear, oh, there's all this money in the deficit and the budgets and billions and bombs, this is an extraordinarily cheap war. I mean, we may call up 30,000 reservists, we haven't yet. The people are on payroll in America and in NATO. Some extra fuel costs, some extra bomb costs. Nobody's gotten killed yet. If there are casualties, they will probably be quite limited. And if you win, against that on the one side, if you win, you can enter the next century and say, we are involved, there is a democracy coalition in the world, we're prepared to assert ourselves, we're not going to make the errors of the 20th century.
Well, let me comment. First of all, I think if the Cold War has made us stupid, the 1930s analogy has made us ultra stupid. You know, this is Madeleine Albright's obsession and the obsession of so many in the foreign policy community, that the only model of international affairs is the 1930s. But that's not a typical model. And it's one thing to prevent aggression by a major power, a power that can truly disrupt the international system and pose a direct threat to America's security. It's something else to become the babysitter of the Persian Gulf, the Balkans, Central Africa, and heaven knows where else. Our current policy shows an inability to make these kinds of basic distinctions between things that matter and things that we can safely pass on to others.
Ed, cheap war?
It is a cheap war, except for the people in the area that we are claiming to help. For them, it has been a very expensive war.
Obviously. All right, last question around the horn, quick answer. What's the upshot of it going to be? What's going to happen?
I think it's a race between a diplomatic face-saving exit for NATO, orchestrated by Russia, and escalating and fighting a war for credibility. I hope the former option proves the effective one.
If the outcome is not a diplomatic outcome with Russia in the picture, whatever the outcome is, it will be disastrous.
I think eventually the Clinton administration and NATO are going to move to the realization that we're going to have to use ground troops in order to win, and then I think we will win fairly handily, and it'll be a good outcome.
Okay. Thank you, Robert Kagan, Ted Carpenter, and Ed Luttwak. I think that the United States in this instance is doing about the right thing. And thank you. For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036, or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org, and please let us know where you watch Think Tank. This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.